Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Week 2 lecture on conflict resolution and labor negotiation. This week, we have a little bit of a short lecture because the lecture only covers one chapter. You only have chapter 3 for this week, so I'm giving you a little break on the reading. In this week, we are going to be discussing the topic of negotiation. Taking what we have learned so far from week 1, chapters 1 and 2, I'd like you to start thinking about some of those theories and theorists that we have discussed so far in chapters 1 and 2, and start thinking about how to kind of create a mental map of, if you will, of linking some of those theories with some of the concepts that you are going to be seeing in this chapter and going forward. The idea is to not get so tied up with who wrote what and whose theory belongs to whom, but rather to make connections between some of the concepts that we can apply in our daily lives in negotiation, and to understand where they came from, theoretically speaking. So again, this week we continue our conversation on negotiation, and the chapter begins with the idea, or it actually begins with defining what negotiation is and what it means to negotiate. And there's one way to describe negotiation. It's collaboration. And collaboration comes from the Latin cum laborare. And cum laborare means precisely working together. Okay? Negotiation means working together. Okay? That's really what it boils down to. I mean, we can talk about fancy terms and fancy theories and make it sound very complicated, but in the end, it's really simple. It's just working together. Okay, so taking this idea as a starting point, what does this mean? Working together. Well, it has to do with the way we approach a problem. All right. And there's different ways. There's actually two key ways that we can approach a negotiation problem. And you can approach it from an integrative negotiation approach, or you can approach it from a distributive negotiation approach. And it's very different if you approach it from one perspective or another. If you approach it from an integrative perspective, you are seeking win-win situations, or you are promoting win-win situations. And these are the types of situations that we want. This is where we want to be. This is the type of approach that we want to give and that we want to embark on when we approach or are faced with a problem. On the other hand, if you approach it from a distributive perspective, then you're coming in from an I win, and who cares what happens? No matter who cares what happens to my counterpart, or who I'm negotiating with, or anybody else for that matter. As long as I win, it doesn't matter. Okay, and whatever the consequences are, it doesn't matter as long as I come out victorious. And that may sound attractive to some individuals, but we will see how it is not the right approach to a problem, and certainly not the right approach to negotiating. This distributive approach lacks a long-range vision, okay? And because it seeks immediate short-term benefits and payoffs, and by doing that, it puts long-term sustainable payoffs in jeopardy. So what we want is a constructive problem-solving approach. Remember that negotiation is really about solving problems. And the goal should always be to maximize the interests of, obviously, of one's interest, right? Self-interest, but while protecting the relationship of all parties. So if you think about negotiation, it's how do I get the most out of a situation? How do I add the most value to a situation or to a problem, but at the same time, I preserve the relationships that I have with those individuals with whom I am engaged in the problem with. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? So that's the balance. That's where we have to strike that balance between maximizing our self-interest, but at the same time protecting those relationships with all of the other parties involved. So let's take a closer look here at distributive versus integrative negotiation. And very quickly, for when we take a distributive negotiation approach, okay, this is a win-lose scenario where one party has a stronger advantage. And certainly you're going to find that sometimes you're going to have an advantage over the party that you're negotiating with. And there will be times, and it happens, in fact, when politicians negotiate over policies or over legislation, or countries negotiate over terms of trade, for example, you're going to have some countries that are going to have an advantage. Certainly, that's natural and that's expected. But that's different. That's different than coming in with the idea that because you have that you must come out victorious and must come out with a greater piece of the pie, so to speak, than your counterpart. And if you don't, then it results in an unsuccessful negotiation. And that has all to do with the way that you perceive the problem and the idea of adding value. An integrative negotiation process is a win-win outcome for all parties concerned, regardless of perceived advantage or inferiority. So how do we achieve the most value? How do I extract the most value out of a situation, and regardless of who comes out on top? But it has to do with, did I do the best that I possibly could in this negotiation, and have I extracted the most value in this negotiation? And if I have, then it's an integrative negotiation process. Distributive negotiation implies highly competitive problems in nature. Parties consider each other as opponents, and many times they consider each other as enemies. On the other hand, integrative negotiation, you have a collaborative environment where parties behave like allies. So it's not working against each other, it's working with each other to try and find a solution that is mutually beneficial. Distributive negotiation can lead to intensified conflict in a winner-take-more or winner-take-all scenario. So it's one of those conflicts where, it's kill or be killed, it's do or die, so to speak. Whereas integrative negotiation, it's using an effective strategy as a conflict management tool. How do we mitigate risk? How do we minimize the damage by working together? Distributive negotiation focuses on the best outcome of the individual, where the individual is trying to maximize his or her own interests, irrespective of the implied loss to the other. And that may seem like it's the right approach, right? Because we're, after all, trying to come out on top. But if you think about it, if you look at the integrative negotiation perspective, this is a focus on a mutually beneficial outcome for all, and finding solutions that are going to meet the best needs for everyone. Think of it as a way to not destroy your opponent, because you're not, if you think about this, for example, in the context of labor negotiations, you're not out there to try and destroy your opponent, right? If your opponent is the labor union, or if your opponent is the firm that is hiring you, what good is it for you to destroy either one, right? You're going to end up without a job at some point. So the idea is, how do I maximize my benefit, but at the same time work with my counterpart to also put them in a situation where they can also gain and add value to themselves as well, because at some point that's going to also give me future benefits. So it's kind of a different perspective. Distributive negotiation is communication controlled and selective. Very different from integrative negotiation, where communication is open and constructive. So rather than controlled and selective, where you are almost very distrustful actually of your opponent, in an integrative negotiation scenario, you seek to have a much more open and transparent communication that will build trust between you and the person that you're negotiating with. So the idea here is, if you think about the analogy of growing the pie, right? If we think about, just let me go back here for a minute. If we think about the distributive negotiation, right? If you think about distributive negotiation, think about when you approach a problem from a distributive negotiation, you're thinking about the pie being fixed. Whereas an integrative negotiation perspective, you don't limit yourself to this fixed pie idea. You think that the pie can be, in fact, made bigger. The pie can grow. The pie can expand. And if you think about that analogy, it's not limiting yourself to the situation at hand. In other words, you're trying to say, okay, this is what we have now, but can we make it bigger? Can we make it better? How can I improve my negotiation strategy by providing perhaps this alternative, or improving my offer? How do I improve my offer to my counterpart to make the offer much more appealing, and therefore give us a greater opportunity to do business, for example, or to agree on a salary, or to agree on terms of employment? So the idea is to grow the pie and not get stuck in that pie being fixed idea, right? All right, so negotiation is a process. Indeed, it's a process. It's something that is constantly moving and constantly changing. How do we improve our ability to negotiate? How do we become better negotiators? Well, there's many things we can do, but there's 4 things that we can do very quickly here, and that's separate the people from the problem, right? Sometimes we get caught up in the person and in where they're from, and what they look like, and what their political or philosophical ideas might be, or background might be. And so if we get stuck on that, we're not going to focus on the problem at hand. The second thing is we focus on interests, not positions. If we start focusing on positions, then we end up with this idea of my interests versus your interests, and that immediately gravitates us to polar extremes, right? It generates potential fears or mistrust, and that's not good, right? So we want to focus on interests. What are we mutually needing from each other? Because remember, people come into negotiations because they need something. You don't bargain with somebody unless you need something from that person, from that country, from that organization, right? Why would you come in and bargain and negotiate if you already have everything that you need, right? So you know that if people do come to the table to negotiate, it's because they are seeking something that you have that they are wanting to get or needing from you. So you have that to begin with. So you focus on the interest and not on the positions. Third, you invest options for mutual gains. All right. So again, this idea of win-win situations, and sometimes you're going to find positions that are so polarized that it's going to become difficult for you to find win-win situations, or at least initially. So what do? Well, you provide options, okay? You provide options where that gives the other party alternatives. It gives the other party something else to consider, and that might create other incentives for the other party to say, you know what, okay, I don't agree in this, but I agree in that. So let's work on that angle, okay? And then lastly, insist on using objective criteria. And what is this? Why is this important? Because people are going to think differently. They're going to see the world differently. They're going to come from different perspectives, different realities, different cultural backgrounds. So if we focus on things that are not objective, we are going to end up with likely with a lot of mistrust and just not agreeing, disagreement. If you use objective criteria like data and information, right, that is credible and that both parties agree on. This is the type of criteria. Like, for example, if you're negotiating on a contractual terms for labor, right? You focus on KPIs, on performance ratings, performance measurements. These are the type of criteria that are going to be much more able to be agreed upon than subjective criteria about somebody's performance or somebody's value, right? So insist on using objective criteria. I added this table here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this table you will find in chapter 3. This is table 3.2, and it's a neat little table. It shows you the mutual gains from the negotiation process, and how, it's kind of a strategy. How do you arrive? How do you obtain these mutual gains? You start with a commitment to negotiate. The first thing is, we're here because we want something from each other. We need something from each other. Okay, and then you move on to assessing costs of no settlement, meaning what would happen? What is the alternative, or what is the opportunity cost, if you will, of not coming to an agreement? And that's important because in the end, people can get upset, people can fight, and you can have two very polarized individuals, very polarized positions. But if you say, okay, look, the cost of not coming to an agreement here is so high for both of us that no matter how polarized we are and how upset we are about this, we have to come to some kind of a solution because the alternative is simply not good for either one. And so once you think about that, you begin with an agreement on a definition of the problem. Make sure that both parties understand the problem, that you agree on the problem, on exactly what the problem is. Then identify interests, concerns, and the goals for each of the parties. You discuss the most important issues first, because those are the ones that are going to require the most discussion and the most time and the most bargaining and trade-offs. You explore alternatives and trade-offs without commitment, right? So this is an opportunity for you to make the pie bigger. This is where you begin to make that pie bigger by providing alternatives, entry points, we call them sometimes. Create packages that maximize gains for all parties. Again, making the pie bigger. Then you evaluate the costs and benefits of all of the alternatives, right? This is the same way you would evaluate a cost benefits of a project, right? You do a cost benefit analysis of alternative A, B, and C, and then you agree on whichever one you find the most desirable and the most beneficial. And then lastly, you formalize the agreement. So this is kind of a step-by-step strategy of finding a mutual gains negotiation process. So what to look for when we negotiate? There's certain things we need to look out for, okay? Be vigilant of these. I'm sorry, let me go back to that. So a few things to look out for when negotiating. Try not to fall into the who's the good guy and bad guy. You know, that good guy, bad guy. He's the bad guy, I'm the good guy. Because if you begin to think about that, it's going to become very hard for you to see the other person under a positive light. Okay? Avoid bad faith negotiating. You do your due diligence, okay? Your due diligence, you find the most that you can from that person that you're coming to business with or negotiating with. But the minute you start trying to pull a fast one, so to speak, right? You pull a fast one on your opponent, that's when things can go sour and go in a direction that you don't want to go to. And we'll get to that towards the end when we talk about the Christian elements, right? What Christian negotiation is all about too. Lack of authority. This is important. If you're negotiating with somebody, make sure that person has the authority to make the decisions. Otherwise, it's almost wasting time. So it's important that you do your due diligence and make sure that when you do go to negotiate, that some formal agreement can come out of that negotiation. Avoid inaccurate data. This can destroy a negotiation when you have inaccurate data. Many for one is a tactic that you also want to avoid. And this is when, usually when the person that you're negotiating with, your opponent, makes a concession or agrees on something very, very early in the negotiation process. And that agreement or that concession that your counterpart has agreed upon may not be so important to that party, but they have agreed on it because later in the negotiation, they're going to ask you to pay back the favor, a quid pro quo type of situation. And that will then be very important to them. And so they're going, that many for one is kind of like you owe me one type of situation where you end up being cornered and almost forced to agree on something that is a much greater value to them and to you that you have to give up because you already agreed on something at the beginning of the process. So be careful with that. And then lastly, information overload. You want to make sure that you don't get caught up into too much information. And sometimes individuals that come into negotiations, they bring a lot of information. They will swamp you with a bunch of statistics and a lot of models and a lot of what seems to be knowledge about a situation. It could be, if they're trying to sell you a house, they could bombard you with a lot of information about real estate prices and trends and this and that, and this may give off the perception that the other party knows a great deal about the negotiation, a great deal about the situation and about the problem, perhaps even more so than you. And so what you might end up is feeling like they know more, and because of that, you are much more prone to agree on things because of that perception. So careful with information overload in negotiation processes. Also avoid deadlocks, right? Deadlocks. We want to be careful, but we also don't want to push the other party to the brink of leaving the table, so to speak. Okay, we want to make sure that we leave the negotiation table, that when we come into bargaining, that we arrive at a solution. But deadlocks can be very problematic. So how do we avoid them? We limit the scope of the problem. So we focus on the problem at hand and not bring in other problems that may make the discussion or the negotiation harder or seem more difficult. We state the other side's case, okay, so that we can, we understand, we acknowledge that the problem has two sides, so to speak, and we can both understand where we're coming from. We focus on the areas of agreement and not focus on the areas where we disagree. Sometimes it's important just to take a break, okay? Maybe during the negotiation, hey, how about let's go out and get some fresh air. Maybe get a cup of coffee, or take a walk. Let's think about this. Sometimes even it's important to take a break, literally take a break for a day or two, and then come back. Okay, we saw this in the 1980s when President Reagan and Prime Minister Gorbachev were negotiating, were meeting in their various summits, and they met. They were trying to negotiate the disarmament, the arms reduction, it took a while, and there were multiple summits, and it didn't work out initially, and perhaps taking a break between one and the other eventually led them to agree and sign the nuclear disarmament deals that they were able to sign, which were very beneficial to both nations and to the rest of the world. So sometimes taking a break is important and necessary. And then, last but not least, seeking additional information. It's always it's always possible that you don't have all the information that you need at your disposal, and if you need something that's going to help you make a better decision, or even to agree on something, it's okay to ask for more information. That only shows that you are interested and that you have an intention to arrive at a good situation, at a win-win situation, and that you're not just there trying to outdo the other person. So it also serves to build trust by seeking additional information. So this is how you avoid deadlocks. Okay, so please read chapter 3. Again, these are some of the key points in chapter 3. There are others, so take some time to read chapter 3. For this week, you have your multimedia discussion board assignment. Okay, this is due Saturday. You are to research the CBU library and identify 4 authors that you found in chapters 1 through 3. Okay, this is where we begin to create these connections, this theoretical mental map, so to speak. Making the connections between the theories and the concepts. And so identify 4 authors that you in chapters 1 through 3. Refer to the references beginning on page 225 and identify the book or article. And then locate the books or articles and review them. So if again here we're just trying to find to identify authors, and then once you have identified these authors, okay, you develop a narrated presentation. Okay, briefly identify the concepts discussed in the textbook. All right, identify information from the article that expands on the information in the book, and then provide your insight into the information that you located, and then repeat that for the articles, right? The remaining articles. This presentation should be short, 3 to 5 minutes long. Again, as always, please try not to read your presentation, and make sure that it's graphic heavy. So if you can provide pictures or graphics to enhance it, that's fantastic. But what I really want to make sure that you don't do is not to read, okay? And then, of course, last but not least, don't forget to respond to at least 2 other students offering additional insight to link the information to theirs. Now, if the class is limited in size, this becomes a little bit more of a challenge, so do the best you can. Okay, and so that's today's presentation. This is week 2's presentation, and I leave you with Corinthians 10:24. Try to do what is good for others, not just what is good for yourselves. We are to consider others, and that means we should go the second mile to think about what the deal will cost the other part. This is all about ethics and Christian ethics in negotiations, right? This is about finding win-win situations, adding value to the negotiation, to the problem, and not destroying your opponent, not coming in there with that mindset of, how do I destroy my opponent? How do I come out on top no matter what? Okay, that's not something that we want to do. That's the Christian way, the ethical way, and the way that makes business sense is to think about negotiations as opportunities to gain value and improve on the current position that we are in through the negotiation process, to find ways where we can come out better than we were at the beginning. Remember that we are negotiating because we need something, and the other party is negotiating because they need something. So once we understand that we both kind of need each other, we can find opportunities to make that pie bigger, improve each of our positions, and add value to not only to the problem but also to ourselves in this current period and going forward. Okay? All right. So I hope you enjoyed this week's presentation. I hope you do well on this week's work. I'm sure you will. And enjoy, and God bless you. Thank you very much.